Someone asked on Reddit, "Teachers, what was the most disturbing thing your student did?" According to you, what the student in which story did is unacceptable. Express your opinion in the comments. Store 1.
Every time he came to school, I knew how dangerous things could be for the other children. I was hired as a CW to monitor a boy who was only 9 years old. He had a history of sexually assaulting other children and was allowed by our school board to attend school, as is his right, but only if he was constantly observed by an adult hired by the board. It was quite an intense job. The boy knew I was watching him and was constantly trying to manipulate every adult and child who got in his way. He had absolutely creepy eyes and personality. Eventually, he transferred from that board to another board in the same district. I was working at that other school in another position on the board, and I saw him studying at that school. He was obviously shocked to see me. I immediately went to the principal and asked to speak to him privately and off the record, because I was violating the student's legal confidentiality by talking about him because of administrative issues, but he was certainly not being observed or monitored in this new school. I felt it was my duty to protect other students. The new administration and principal of this school were unaware of his past. His record was expunged from the first school board because of his age and other factors. I was respected, and they believed me and unofficially observed him, and also exempted him from the standard requirement of going to the restroom with another student.
Store 2.
There was a test that day, but the real test was me facing my conscience. I worked as an English teacher in Pakistan for a few months. It is normal to scare children when they do something really wrong. It was during an exam. I saw a naughty student cheating. He had brought a guide and was copying an article from it. He was a first-year high school student. When I was a student, I learned this from one of my professors who allowed us to cheat on purpose. He said that at graduation, he only wanted us to study the course content, even if it meant cheating on exams. This is exactly what he said. You can never forget something you cheat and write down during an exam. It was true. When I caught him, I just took the guide, tore his paper, and gave him a new one. A few minutes later, a senior teacher came in and started checking the papers. The original pages I had been given were signed by him to prevent anyone from bringing in pre-written papers. The new page I gave him had no signature. I am sure that senior professor just wanted to blow off some steam. He started roughing up the boy. I was dumbfounded. I was studying in a similar environment, but I was watching something so horrible. The professor kept asking why there was no signature. I opened my mouth to say something, but the boy was naughty but more mature than I realized. As soon as I opened my mouth, he secretly signaled me to keep quiet. I quickly realized that telling the teacher the reason would only make things worse for him. I just stood there and watched him beat this boy for 5 minutes. There was one more scene. In the morning after the final exams, a boy came in who had a really muscular body, but he was staggering a bit. I thought nothing of it. They had an exam that day. He failed. I'm guilty. I took a stick and asked him to put his hands in front of him. I saw his hand, and there were dark bruises on it. I asked him why he had these bruises. He said he had failed one of his final exams and his father had done it to him. I never hit him again. Never.
Story 3.
When he told me that he was afraid of being alone with his mother when his father was away, things were much darker than I thought. I was teaching a special needs enrichment program at the time. These children were not necessarily disabled, rather than needing extra attention because of problems at home, language barriers, things like that. One of the children was a quiet, shy girl. Most days she was very friendly and happy, but she could also be painfully shy and sad. One afternoon I saw that she was having a difficult day, so I went to her desk and talked to her about her day, how her homework was going, whether she had any special plans for the coming weekend. She started crying, and I asked her what was bothering her. She told me that her father would not be home on Saturday and that she was afraid of being alone with her mother. I didn't answer right away. As I have learned many times, an empty and open silence invites the storyteller to continue without distraction. And she looked at me, brimming with tears. She took a shaky breath and whispered in a voice so low that it was almost inaudible. My mom hurts me when my dad is not home. I shrunk down to match her size and, adjusting to her tone, asked her what she meant. She was so scared he was shaking. She poked holes in the table, looking so hard. After what seemed like an eternity, she told me that her mother had forced her to lie down and shoved wooden kitchen spoons into her vagina and anus. As she told her story, the girl peed herself out of fear. As a teacher, I was a mandatory reporter. I had moral and emotional obligations as well as a legal obligation to deal with. I stopped one of my assistants and got the girl some clean clothes and made sure she was safe and comfortable while I called my supervisor and told her what had happened. To summarize, I rescued the poor girl from the hands of her cruel mother, and made sure she received psychological support, thanks to the necessary organizations. She is doing much better now than she was before. If I had sat at her desk that day and asked her if she had any plans for the weekend, I would not have found out any of this.
Story 4.
When I confronted him in my office, I can say that what he took out of his backpack was the end of him. I taught at the university. I taught mostly seniors and graduate students. I basically had to sit in my office with a disturbed student and get him to talk while the campus police searched his office and workspace. The kid made horrible remarks towards other students, and the students waited until it got really bad to tell me. When I intervened, he started threatening me. From my personal cell phone, my personal email, things like that. My husband told me to tell the campus police, so I did, but everyone told me there was nothing they could do. My department head couldn't even kick him out of my class because he was enrolled in a different department. His home department was slow to do anything. I arranged a meeting with him, ostensibly to talk to him, but I had told my assistant to search his things. My assistant immediately called the campus police, and the police went with him to search those areas. They found enough stuff in his office to expel him, but none of it was incriminating, until he brandished a gun from his backpack. This happened when he left my office and my TA and the campus police were standing there. I saw a campus police officer literally shoot him in the foot.
Story 5.
A few years ago, I was teaching 7th grade, and one of my students was a little unstable. Not crazy as in, I'm going to hurt you, but crazy as in, I have an old toy chest. It's full of all my haircuts and a picture of my mom's beautiful friend. I'm going to name this child Carmine. One day, Carmine comes to school and you hear that he is sick as a slug, as if the thing isn't going anywhere. Oceans of melted mucus clog his nose. He grunts every 5 seconds, blowing his nose. Hard, fleshy pulses from his nose. Tissue fills tissue. That day, everyone in my class was reading independently. I glanced around the classroom and saw Carmine hunched over his book, leaning sideways in his chair, blowing his nose into a stiff handkerchief. I thought the poor boy must be sleeping at home. Then, as Carmine opened the huge, wet handkerchief, looked around the room suspiciously, and took a big lick from the contents, I thought, "Why, God? Why?" Then another one. Then I walked up behind him as calmly as I could and said, "Hey, Carmine, please throw that away." The look in his eyes was not shameful. It was more like the greedy, defensive look I get when I approach my dog when he's gnawing on a bone. The look was 100%. No, it's mine. You can't take it. And that was it. That, and I once saw a kid recklessly watching a +18 video during reading time. He was so bored he was watching a +18 video on his phone.
Story 6.
He's my high school head coach, so he's close enough. We had a weekend travel meeting. Everyone seemed fine. They were having a great time, and everything went well. Well, actually, something always happens, but overall, it was a good weekend. Next year's coming, and I start to realize that one of my student athletes has some home problems that he is hiding with substances. Mostly weed, but I suspect some other hard stuff too. And alcohol. I do my best during the season to talk to them, be there for them, and try to get them away from harmful substances and alcohol. It's going well. They tell me that they have quit drinking and tobacco completely and are in a much better mood. Then their mom has to go back to rehab. Because of the alcohol, she leaves early and comes back again, but they seem to be doing well enough until one day they come to the team dinner, and they look a bit awkward. I talked to them and found out that they had smoked a ton of weed before they came. I also found out that they had tried to end their own lives the year before by smoking a bottle of Tylenol at the travel meetup. I started talking to their friend about working with me by being supportive and just being there for them. That friend started telling me that the student athlete started having crying spells during club practices. And that's the situation right now. This is really disturbing for me because I have spent so much time working with them, being there for them, supporting them, and doing everything I can to help them be the best they can be. But they are still going down this dangerous path that leads to more and more poverty, and I am not sure I can do more. The school is already aware of their problems.
Story 7.
In my math class, he was quiet and gentle, but when he moved to English, he lost all control. My wife and I taught together in the same high school for a while and shared many of the same students. We shared one particular student with whom we had completely different experiences. In my math class, he was not bothered by the class or by me as a teacher. He was relatively calm and kind to me. However, when she went to his English class, she became a completely different person. She did not like his class at all. He disliked it so much that he tried to leave the class several times. Here are some of the major events that happened in about a week before she was finally suspended from school altogether. First, during the transition period on his way to English class, he came down the stairs and said he was paralyzed and couldn't go to class. The nurse checked him, and despite his death, he was still sent back to class. A few days later, at the beginning of English class, he tried to escape again. This time, he wet his pants in class, without hesitation. This attempt was a little more successful than the last one because then he was allowed to go home for the rest of the day. Unfortunately, he had to return the next day. His last act a few days later finally achieved his goal. Again, while in English class, this student began to pleasure himself at his desk. For his obscene behavior, he was removed from the class and soon suspended from school altogether. He was then enrolled in a juvenile detention center to continue his education.
Story 8.
Years later, I met him again, and when I found out what really happened, I was stunned. In August, a few weeks after school started, our teacher walked in. The teacher, Mr. Smith, put down his things and called roll, but when they called Michael, he sat quietly. I was busy counting how many steps I would have to take to get to school if I hadn't taken the bus. To my surprise, I saw Michael push his desk, stand up, and start shouting at Mr. Smith. Our teachers were trained for this kind of thing, but Michael wouldn't allow it. He bit Mr. Smith and started crying loudly. In the style of the most MLB pitcher of all time, he started throwing things. He picked up his chair and threw it across the room. Everyone was screaming and freaking out. Meanwhile, I crawled under my desk, trying not to have a panic attack. I don't remember what happened next, but I know Michael never came to school again. A few years later, I found him in public again. This was in 7th grade. Anyway, I see him in a Barnes & Noble in the shopping district of our city. We talk for about 45 minutes while our parents, I don't know, whatever it is that adults do in bookstores. Here's the particularly crazy part. It turned out that Michael had been abused since birth. His father wanted a girl and at least a normal child. His father was interested in sports. Michael was interested in welding no matter what. Autistic people have certain obsessions. So his father started to physically hurt him instead of Michael's mother. That day, Michael said enough was enough. His father burned him with cigars that morning because Michael wouldn't calm down to put on his socks. The teacher called his name, and he started to freak out, saying, "Never mind." The police reported him screaming in his house the following week, and here's a really great guy. A new neighbor moved in who didn't know Michael was autistic, just that he was having a nervous breakdown. The police arrived. Michael opened the door when his parents were not home, and boom. They noticed his arms, saw the burns and the band-aids from the injury, and pulled the 9-year-old away. They arrested his father for all kinds of crimes. Initially, they were poor, so there was no bail for his father. They got social assistance, they moved into an apartment, and that's how things are now. He's scheduled to come out in about 12 years. And Michael has really straightened himself out. He's a very nice guy now. We changed our Steam usernames and we played Dota 2 from time to time.
Story 9.
I couldn't think of anything else as he ran towards the students with those scissors. I had to intervene. I was teaching high school, and one of my students once walked into the classroom and pulled a girl's hair so hard you could hear her head being pulled back. Her friend stood up to defend her, but the first student didn't like it. He ran to my desk, grabbed a pair of scissors, and ran towards the defending student. "I'm going to destroy him," he kept repeating, and I jumped out of my desk to get between them. Maybe it wasn't the best move, but I couldn't stand by and do nothing. I convinced the first student to hand over the scissors and took him to the principal. Somehow he escaped from the office and went back to my office. The defending student was sitting next to me at the time doing some math problems, and when the first boy ran into the classroom, they both stood up and looked at each other. The school counselor ran into the classroom after the boy and tried to get him out. The boy looked the defending student in the eye and said, "I'm going to ruin you." I can deal with a lot of things, but honestly, that chilled me to the bone. I locked my classroom for the rest of the day. A few days later, he was arrested, found breaking into houses with the intention of finding weapons. This disruptive student was expelled from the school, but because I was the one who stepped in and stopped the attack, everyone kept calling me a hero, and they felt like they were counting on me to keep them safe if he came back and attacked our students. I wasn't getting paid enough for that kind of pressure, so I resigned after about a month when I was offered a great job.
Story 10.
At that moment, I understood why Jim was standing so quietly in the corner, and what he said chilled me to the bone. I teach 4-year-olds part-time, which means I usually do arts and entertainment in the afternoons. There is a girl in my class, let's call her Mary, who is a tiny troublemaker who often runs around and makes the other children cry. Her actions are very calculated, and pulling hair, knocking over a toy, grabbing artwork. She waits for the other child to cry, then gives up. She never wants the toy, she just wants the reaction. On the other hand, this child, Jim, is his complete opposite and often the voice of reason in my classroom. He is a gentle giant, the biggest boy in preschool. He happily shares, is kind during playtime, and is probably the most thoughtful person I have ever met. One day during outside time, Mary kept targeting Jim. Jim was quite good-natured the whole time. She would snatch a shovel from him, and Jim would gently respond by saying things like, "That's okay, you can have it. Toys are for sharing." Sidebar. Do you remember those giant red and yellow cars that children used to sit on and pedal with their feet? There are 5 of them in the garden for children to share. Mary was leaning against a wall and Jim was pushing one of those cars. The children liked to run with them, so it was normal. Jim was probably 30 feet away from Mary when he suddenly started to accelerate. Like a guided missile, he was pointed at poor, confused Mary. He really believed that she would turn around or stop at the last moment. I was wrong. He crashed the car into Mary and slammed her into the wall. I'll never forget how long it took her to breathe. I was shaking. I thought he had cracked her ribs. Her whole back was bruised, but thankfully there was no other damage. After handing Mary to my colleague, I turned to Jim, who was standing sullenly in the corner, and asked, "Why did you do that?" He shrugged his shoulders and said very calmly, "I was just trying to solve our problem. I'm 100% scared of this kid now."
Story 11.
I was teaching in an alternative high school, and most of my students were kids on probation, kids from areas with a lot of gang violence. A lot of them had problems with being born addicted to harmful substances. These kinds of things. I had one student that I worked very hard to build a good relationship with. One Friday, he looked me in the eye and told me, completely calmly, that I shouldn't come to work on Monday. He kept telling me that he didn't want me to be there on Monday. When I finally asked him why I shouldn't come to work on Monday, he told me that it would ruin it. I said, "You know I have to report this, right?" He told me to do what I had to do. He was arrested right outside my classroom, and I had to be questioned by the police. It was really traumatic, to be honest. Even though I knew nothing was going to happen on Monday, I ended up going out because my anxiety was through the roof. I went out a lot after that and got a new job shortly after that, but I still feel a lot of compassion for that student. I think about him often. I hope he's okay.
Story 12.
I work in an international program in China, and this year we had a big scandal over a high school senior who killed a cat on campus. I teach freshmen, and a big part of my job is to encourage students to learn. I remember this boy very clearly because of 2 things. First, he was very interested in physics and liked to show me his diagrams between classes. Second, he would get strangely angry when one of his classmates, a girl, maybe someone he liked or something, got scratched by one of the cats on campus and had to get a rabies vaccination for it. It was a completely ordinary encounter, all things considered, but I clearly remember him saying that he was going to make a weapon to destroy it, and then he did it. One day during lunch break this year, he took out this Gauss rifle, I think it's a magnetic gun, and shot a BB gun into the head of one of the cats in the middle of a group of 10 students. Then over Messenger, he finally bragged to another student about how justice had been served. The second boy didn't find it so heroic. In fact, the second boy took a screenshot of the whole conversation and posted the whole thing on social media, tagging, here's the kicker, the principal, the local police department, the local newspaper, and the city department of education. Hence the scandal. I had to walk past a group of reporters on my way to work to find out what happened the day after the incident, and what happened to him. That ridiculous personality graduates with honors and doesn't even get a slap on the wrist because his father runs hospitals for the poor in the countryside.
If you have a story you would like to share, please share it with us in the comments. Also, subscribe to my channel for more Reddit stories like this. And don't forget to turn on notifications. Take care, friends.